Well, welcome back as we continue on with day 2 of the America's Future Series Defense Innovation Summit. I'm Scott Murray. This is David Hamilton, and we are delighted to welcome you all. We have had a busy month here in the month of April, but it's been great. And I've learned a lot, I'll tell you that.
I've learned that moderating a panel is not easy.
That's something I've done for years.
Yes, that's something. So I more and more respect.
But I have great respect for all the people that we've heard.
Yes, they've been fantastic. And
both the moderators and the panelists. Oh my gosh.
170-ish, I think, is what we're at in terms
I think
of
that's
total
fantastic.
Yeah,
so take a bow. This is, of course, the man that made it all happen over a decade ago, the creator, the CEO of America's Future Series. David, it is all yours. Take it away, my friend.
Well, thank you, sir. So we've had a great program. We're going to continue on. We're going to bring on our great and good friend, Heather Richman of BM&T. Heather has been a big supporter of our program. She's moderated panels, connected us with people. I like to say she's probably most heavily connected Uber networker, if you will, in the innovation startup tech space on the planet. So anyway, Heather, welcome. And want to thank you for joining us again.
David, thank you for having me. Thank you for what you guys are doing and for this conversation. We really appreciate it. Round 2, I guess we'll kick it off without further ado. I am really thrilled. This is more fun for me than anyone else, but I get to work with these two gentlemen who I'm about to introduce to you and talk about kind of this change that we're seeing in national service and how we're really changing the face of national security focused entrepreneurialism. So these two have been at it for a while. I'll let them tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. But first of all, Steve Blank is a Silicon Valley entrepreneur and co-creator of something called Hacking for Defense, which we'll get into. Steve is recognized for developing customer development method that launched the lean startup movement methodology, which recognized that startups are not smaller versions of large companies. Next to Steve, there is Pete Newel, the managing director of BM&T Partners. Prior to BM&T, he served as the director of the U.S. Army's Rapid Equipping Force, reporting directly to senior leadership, where he's invested over $1.4 billion in developing solutions to answer soldiers' most pressing needs. Pete and Steve, thank you so much for being here. It's nice and early here on the West Coast. We're gonna do this a couple different ways here. First of all, I'm gonna ask Pete and Steve to talk a little bit about the history of Hacking for Defense, how this all came together. It's quite an interesting story, very authentic. And then actually we're gonna invite in one of our inaugural team members from the first Hacking for Defense class, who later became a TA in the class. And then we'll get into kind of how your university can participate if interested. So Steve, Pete, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. So how did you guys meet? Steve, how'd you get to meet Pete?
Well, I was teaching a prior class on innovation called the Lean Launchpad, which is now the National Science Foundation Innovation Corps. And one of my students was a special forces operator who said, hey, this methodology you're teaching sure seems a lot like what Pete Newel and the Rapid Equipping Force is doing. And Pete just retired. He has a small startup in Palo Alto. You guys ought to grab coffee. And at least my memory was, I think both Pete and I thought we'd have a 5-minute meet or greet. And after meeting, we realized we had spent 2.5 hours together whiteboarding out what we had both learned. And I'll let Pete tell his version, but I'm sticking to mine.
So it was an accident. We call it serendipity. I think the pace at which serendipity strikes me these days has climbed dramatically since I met Steve. So I'll just say that Steve and I self-actualized around something. We were prototyping a way for DoD to have a conversation in Silicon Valley about something important to DoD. And proving that this problem, introducing a problem as a way to start a conversation was worthwhile engaging DoD folks. And I had recruited the special forces officer to actually kind of help with this thing over spring break. And he came in one day and he said, I'm taking this class called Lean Startup, and it's taught by Steve Blank. And I kind of looked at him because I'd never heard of Steve. And quite frankly, I'm the last guy who should have ever started a business in Silicon Valley. But when Steve showed up, it was Steve Blank coming in for a 5-minute coffee. And that conversation devolved into a 3-hour whiteboarding session between the two of us, where we suddenly realized that what Steve had been teaching and building a language for 10 years of innovation was the virtually the same thing that I self-discovered while I was sending solutions into the battlefield in Afghanistan. The fact that there is a methodology to how you build things and get solutions deployed. That we kind of landed on that, and then I think we were doing the outbrief from this exercise to former SecDef Bill Perry and a few others, and we'd had a bunch of students help us. And as we got to the part of what do you do next, we were looking at Bill saying, this is a great event, but it's not scalable. We hijacked a bunch of Stanford students during spring break, and quite frankly, during the year, they're busy and they're kind of erratic and not reliable if you want to do something that doesn't involve their schoolwork. Only to have some kid stand up in the back of the room, wave his hand and say, hey, wait a minute, had this been a class at Stanford, I would have taken it.
How long ago was this?
5 years ago?
5 years.
5 years. Yeah.
So how, so you took Smile and Darren, they just called you erratic and unreliable, but we'll get to that in a minute.
We will get to that in a minute.
Okay, so you've got this kind of model, right? This 5-day model, and how did you then kind of pull that thread and create the class? Steve, talk a little bit about kind of what the class looks like.
So, one of the big things about this lean methodology that we talk about in Silicon Valley, and it's kind of funny because when talked about in the DoD, the minute you say lean, people talk about losing billets or cutting budgets, and that's the antithesis of what it is. Lean refers to just a different way to kind of build things. Is that the big idea in Silicon Valley was at the turn of the century, 21st century, we realized that, startups, new ventures, innovation weren't smaller versions of large things, large companies or large government organizations. We were doing something very different. We weren't managing a set of knowns and known processes. We were actually dealing with a set of unknowns. But there were no tools. There wasn't even a language to talk about that. There was no methods to manage, unknowns. We kept like trying to write requirements and execute what we thought on day one. And it turns out that we would discover much later that we were wrong about, a whole set of assumptions. And I tell you this as a background because we developed this lean methodology as a contrast to dealing, instead of with knowns, a whole set of unknowns, which is what innovation is all about. On day one in innovation, there really are no facts inside the building. Trying to write requirements and specify projects or products, it just is a real waste of resources, time, manpower, et cetera. So the lean methodology basically said, let's get out of the building and try to understand whether any of our assumptions are correct. Let's use a new type of way to develop products instead of waterfall engineering, a serial process. Let's build things with something called agile engineering, which allows us to build a piece at a time and test it incrementally and iteratively. And that had some real consequences because the minute you did that, you could put in front of potential customers, partners, in this case, warfighters, something called a minimum viable product, which was not just a prototype, but something that says, is it the right size or weight? Does this fit through a ship hatch or on an aircraft, or is this the right user interface? And if not, you could go back and if you get enough data that says some of your assumptions are wrong, and this is really a key difference between just executing a process, is you could pivot. And a pivot is a fancy word for, I got enough data to say my assumptions are wrong. So instead of just finishing out this process, why don't I change what I'm doing based on this input? And that makes you incredibly fast, incredibly agile, and have the ability to deliver things that people want and need. And then the last part of this is we use a single piece of paper called the mission model canvas to kind of figure out what are all the assumptions we need to test. And I say all this as kind of a preamble in that this seems pretty simple to just kind of describe this. That is, you use execution when you have knowns, but you use lean when you have a series of unknowns. And Silicon Valley rapidly adopted this. We went from people without a methodology to people who now had a rifle shot methodology, but there was still no class for this. So at Stanford, I stood up the first class called the Lean Launchpad a decade ago now, and literally 6 weeks after the class ended, the National Science Foundation adopted it. as a prerequisite for any scientist and principal investigator who wanted to get an SBIR or STTR grant, needed to take the class. It's now in 100 universities and adopted by the NIH. And then I think about 5-6 years ago, inside the NSA. So that's the precursor to when I met Pete. We start having a conversation about Pete's experience on the battlefield. Turned out to be the same process that we kind of invented with Lean, with a real set of secret sauce. I'll let him talk about it at the front end. And then we started talking about is how could we engage students in some real serious DoD and IC problems. And we realized we already had a backbone of a class that already had been built and now scaled. And was it possible to use that same class to go out to the DoD and IC and get their problems and have students work on those? So I'll toss it back to Pete.
So, I think that a really simple way to explain the experience is I realized as we started putting solutions on the battlefield in Afghanistan, that quite frankly, we often handed people solutions that were too late or were improperly suited. But the epiphany I had is that I never had an honest conversation about what the problem I was supposed to be solving was until I tried to hand somebody a solution. And rather than go through the expense of spending hundreds of millions of dollars on things that people wouldn't use or didn't need, we realized that if we could prototype forward, and as Steve said, if we could build minimum viable products, not as potential solutions, but as ways to drive a conversation about the problem, we could increase the cycle of which we were actually solving things. And to take it to extremes, I went so far as to build and deploy mobile 3D printing labs to the forward edge of the battlefield in Afghanistan with engineers and 3D scanners and 3D printers and CNC milling machines, simply because we wanted to build these minimum viable products to give us feedback on the problem we were really supposed to be solving. The other thing I realized is that most problems that were articulated to us by people on the battlefield were symptoms of a different problem. And we spent lots of capital, human capital and financial capital, perfectly solving the wrong things, rather than taking the time to completely understand the problems that we were supposed to be, prioritize them based on our ability to get them into the system, and then actually turning out solutions at the right time and at the right place that they could be used. And that's the process of problem sourcing and curation blended itself with this lean methodology and the discovery required, and realized that it's not till you hit the middle of the innovation pipeline where you're doing discovery that you actually validate your problem as you're trying to figure out what the right solution is. And it's the combination of two that generates the acceleration you need to actually get new things out. In my case, to get new things out of the battlefield.
So just to be clear, these are not hypothetical problems. These are real life, legitimate, real-time challenges that you're working on.
Yeah, so go ahead, Pete.
I would say the thing that drove it home emotionally to me is in 2010, we surged 20,000 light infantrymen into Afghanistan. And at the time we were funding a $1.5 billion program to send heavy mine protected vehicles that would protect them from IEDs. What nobody caught was that for the Taliban and Al Qaeda, it was significantly cheaper to attack dismounted infantrymen with no armor protection with IEDs than it was to go after those big armored vehicles that we spent billions of dollars protecting. Unfortunately, the effect of killing 5 men on a squad on the ground is the same as blowing up a vehicle. We missed that, and the time it took us to catch up with that cycle, it took us literally 14 months to recognize there was a new problem, and another 14 months to deliver a suite of solutions. So 28 months, which is light years by DoD standard. The Taliban were turning that cycle in 8 months. So one cycle for us, 28 months. The Taliban were coming up with new ways to kill young Americans every 8 months. The gap between the two cost us 5,000 casualties. So yes, it's very real, very, very real.
And so one of the consequences, Heather, about this process, whether it's in a class or actually implemented in now places inside the DoD, is the ability to deeply understand the problem rapidly and then figure out solutions at speed and then figure out scale to deployment at speed. And that is one of the things we teach in the class. For me, the motivation goes back maybe 40 years, as I spent 4 years in the Air Force during Vietnam, and then did 8 startups in Silicon Valley before I became an educator. But I always believed, just personally, that we had made a major mistake. We had run a giant science experiment for 40 years. What happens when you disconnect the body populace from any skin in the game of foreign policy? And at least in my opinion, we ended up in a series of perpetual wars, kind of outsourcing our military adventures. And here I was teaching in universities where the students, most of them, unless they had picked a public service path, had no notion of what the government did or the military did. And I thought that was actually just bad for the country in general. And I was looking for a way to kind of yet again connect some of our best and brightest, not just at Stanford, but from day one, we had the vision of this being in 50 universities. And so I kind of, on day one, said, well, how can we get, in every research university, students who had never even considered understanding what the government did, whether it was a service branch or combatant command or part of the IC. And so, for me, the motivation was this notion of service, whether it was national service or public service. That's been a big thing in my life personally, and a big thing that I wanted our students to understand. And so when Pete started talking about this idea, I realized we not only had an existing class, but it could solve a dual problem that I had in the back of my head. Was, again, how do we get the students who would never think about working with their counterparts kind of engaged? And I'm proud to say we've managed to do that. As you know, Hacking for Defense is now in, I think, 47 or 50 universities across the US and in Australia and the UK. But I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. So
That's all.
I mean, what has been, kind of when you started this, what has been the biggest surprise for you guys? I know that you've talked to students at the beginning of it. How likely might they be to go into quote unquote national service? I think you're redefining that. What has been the reaction from the students? And Darren, I'll let you answer this one too if you want to jump in. But just
So,
from beginning to end.
The hypothesis we started was we didn't know that Stanford would let us teach this course. We didn't know that we could convince government people to give us unclassified problems for students to work on. And quite frankly, we didn't know that the students would even be interested in taking the class. I mean, this is Stanford. And the immediate surprise was, first, I call it light years. Steve recruited Tom Byers, who's the director of the Stanford Venture Technology Program and the Manufacturing Science and Engineering School, and got this course approved, the curriculum built, the educators got it done, and actually started class in 9 months. If there's an educator on here, that's a 3-year process.
So Pete, if you remember, part of the reason we were able to move so fast at Stanford was not only Tom's good work, but we got my first boss in Silicon Valley, who was now at Stanford, Bill Perry, to be the guy for the class. So after I got out of the Air Force, I joined a startup which was run by a PhD mathematician working on overhead reconnaissance problems and other things, which was Bill's company. And that was my first startup in Silicon Valley. And it was great to kind of bookend my career with Bill being the sponsor along with Tom of the class, which kind of cut down a lot of the traditional barriers that one runs into. But I'm sorry, Pete.
So the second one is the government problem sponsors. We leverage personal connections. DIU was just starting at the time, and BM&T and DIU were kind of like hinged together. I just happened to be escorting the senior leadership for what was then the Joint Improvised Threat Defeat Agency through Silicon Valley, and over beer night, I was bending the J8, the guy who really handles requirements and stuff, his ear. And I talked about this course, and he finally looked at me and said, fine, I'll give you some problems for the course, but you have to agree to actually teach this to my workforce too. We ended up with 14 government organizations delivering us 28 problems, and we could only take 8 into the course. So oddly enough, it became a competitive environment for the government problem sponsors to convince students to take on their problem. And then finally, and I'm thankful that Darren Howell's on here, we had 190 students register their interest in a class that could only seat 32. So almost like a baby incubator, we had a competitive environment where government problem sponsors had to compete with one another for the attention of the students, which means they had to be all into it. And then we had students trying to build the best team they could with the best problem for that team, competing to get into the class. And it was just an amazing collision of the best and brightest things you could do. And the first class was just, I would say it was scary in terms of the absolute brilliance of the students in the room and the speed at which they came to understand really complex issues in the government and turn out potential solutions. It was absolutely amazing to watch.
Pete, can I ask you a question about that? This is Greg Leman. I did a lot of similar project-based learning work in Baylor classrooms. What student pools were you drawing from? What level and disciplines were making up these teams?
So it was fortunate, and I credit Tom Byers, I think, for our goal was to make sure that the course was completely interdisciplinary. In fact, and Steve will tell you from building companies that the only way you get diversity of thought is to get a diversity of people, or a diverse group of people in a room. So we wanted to make sure it was completely interdisciplinary, which, that the challenge at university sometimes you get one school to offer it, but the others won't give credit to the students for it.
Right.
We spent a lot of time in the background talking to multiple schools, whether it's a business school, the engineering school, I think even the medical school got involved. So at Stanford and at most universities who teach today, it is an interdisciplinary course that grants credit to all students who take it. At Stanford, we went after graduate students and high functioning undergrads who could get on teams. And I've been surprised. We've had a couple of completely undergrad teams, and in some cases, a couple of freshmen who absolutely blew us away in terms of what they do. There are a couple of universities in the US today that teach to strictly undergrad populations. James Madison University runs a fantastic course for undergrads. And the University of Texas Austin also runs one for undergrads. So I think they're brilliant at getting younger students involved with the concept of national public service and entrepreneurship at the same time. Steve, I miss anything?
No, the thing I just should note is that this is a team-based class. That is, it's not students individually working on these projects. These are teams of 4. They have to apply. We interview them, etc. And the other interesting thing about the class is that it's most of the work, in fact, 99% of it is outside the classroom. That is, the teams have to get out and test their hypotheses. So they're talking to, by design, 10 to 15 beneficiaries, stakeholders, warfighters, requirements writers every week. And then they come back into class and present to the teaching team, here's what we thought, here's what we did, here's what we learned, here's what we're doing next week. And building what we call this minimum viable product every week, a new one to put in front of customers. That's an enormous workload, which Darren, I'm sure, will tell us about. But it's amazing to see the productivity. As Pete said, the speed of learning is just astonishing, and what they deliver at the end of that 10 weeks it's not just us at Stanford, because this thing was designed to scale to other universities, because this is being repeated, but this is also being repeated now inside of islands of innovation inside the DoD that's adopted the methodology. And obviously that's what we need to compete. I mean, I don't have to tell this audience is that not only are we competing with nations, non-nation states, but our peers like China or near peers like Russia are setting the pace now, and the innovations that we need, a good chunk of them are being driven by commercial technologies, no longer in the control of the DoD, which these students happen to be masters at. So it's an interesting intersection of needs and timing.
So as far as, I mean, when I've been privy to a few of these classes, and I mean, I think those coming from the defense space think you have to know about the defense space to work on the defense space. You're bringing in, fresh blood on these teams. I mean, what has been the effect of that, of having just fresh eyes on problems that have been very much DoD entrenched for so long?
I can, and I'll tell you anecdotally, I was surprised that some of the fastest, best learning comes from teams that had no connection with DoD at all. And in fact, I will say some of the hardest crashes and most painful pivots to watch were from students who were supposedly experts at the defense base when they suddenly realized that everything they thought they knew was wrong. We watched, and I give you for instance, the first year, Army Cyber Command had sponsored a problem related to countering radical social media, in the Middle East. And it got to the point about 2/3 of the way through the class where the students became frustrated with the staff at Army Cyber because the students knew more about the problem and more about how Army Cyber functioned with that problem, that the staff was no longer then giving them useful guidance. And we couldn't tell the students, the MVPs that they were producing, Army Cyber was sending straight into theater to test and evaluate because it was so far ahead of where they thought they were. And I can tell you that's repeated itself over and over and over again, where students who know nothing about defense suddenly were putting charts up on the screen about not the organizational structure, but the organizational influence structure of the organization that actually blows people's minds. In fact, a couple of cases, people were convinced those charts were classified because they were so detailed. But it's simply based on the learning. Steve?
Yeah, same, Pete. Because students have to, I think someone mentioned the fresh eyes. One of the things we teach them is they have to draw the information flow between these systems or people or organizations, and also the influence flow, and then how a requirements is written. The class is not designed to do demos. The DoD has more demos than any other organization in the world. The class is designed to teach these students is how do you go from a problem to test solutions to get to deployment at scale. Well, that go from demo to deployment is a equally big idea as just understanding the problem. And so teaching them how to kind of peel the onion of, oh, we have these users on the battlefield who need X. Well, great. How do you get that solution to them? Well, that's really an interesting thing, teaching kids who have never seen the DoD or the requirements process or the PBE and how does this work? And they figure it out. And they figure it out in a way that's kind of astonishing because it took me years. And literally, we now have a way to kind of help them understand this, or at least teach them how to understand it themselves in a very short period of time. It's an impressive learning process.
Awesome. Darren, I'm going to pick on you for a minute. Thank you so much for joining us. You were part of the inaugural class and then actually, became a TA. How did you hear about it? What interested you about it? I'm so fascinated, just kind of how you got involved in all this.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I'll do a quick overview as well. I think a lot of this is just personal motivation of wanting to do something related to public service. Of course, being in a place like Silicon Valley, it's not as obvious as a route to public service as you might have in other areas. So when this course came out, I was immediately interested in seeing what I could learn and what I could do. And I do emphasize both of them because although students are incredibly fast at picking up things, we also want to have a level of humility to know that we are learning from some of the experts, but we're not afraid to put in our own dose of what we see out in industry. So if I think about what I got out of the Hacking for Defense program, first of all, Steve Blank's mission model canvas approach has been invaluable. I have used that over and over again outside of this class to vet ideas. And then the second thing is just an introduction to understanding what the DoD and IC actually does. Helping civilians understand what the military does is, I think, very important for us. People are surprised to hear that 7th Fleet cares about IUU fishing, right? It's not ostensibly a military problem, but it's very related. Or that the Navy SEALs are still tracking some aspects of training with pen and paper, right? These seem to be problems that are very uncontroversial that we should be trying to solve. So, why does this matter? I think we just need more people in technology and in other industries to know that they can productively engage with the DoD to solve problems we all care about, rather than have a knee-jerk reaction and say, oh, I'm never going to work with the DoD, or the DoD is holy and sacrosanct. We need talented people who are able to articulate the principles that we as the United States stand for. The last thing I would say is, Pete and Steve highlighted some fantastic success stories. And certainly not every team achieves those results with every sponsor, but even something as simple as working with the sponsor to discover the right problem to solve and bridging that civilian military divide, as I mentioned before, is invaluable. So, some of the things that have happened with students from the class, I took the inaugural class, then became a TA, and have been helping scale the Hacking for Defense program in a small but hopefully important way. I see what other students have done. Some have worked directly with the DoD and IC with their startups. And again, whether they succeed or fail, it exercises that muscle of innovation between government and private industry. Some have slotted directly into DoD innovation arms. One of my teammates in Hacking for Defense is now a technical director of AI at DIU, which is incredible. And then finally, some of us are focused primarily on solving other big problems, for example, climate change, et cetera, but we're lending our expertise where we can. So this is kind of my own case. I don't focus primarily on national security, but again, I took the inaugural class, I TA'd the class the next year, helped scale the program nationally by vetting problems, which is again, a small but hopefully important part of this. And now, as part of Schmidt Futures, I informally advise Eric when he's talking with this stuff. I informally advise DIU when it's necessary. Again, just helping out where I can. Hopefully that answers the question.
No, it does. So what was your major? What year were you? How old were you? Kind of when you started this, trying to figure out like what your mindset was.
Yeah, I was in a really weird case myself because I was supposedly the class of 2011, but I actually had taken 2 years off to do my own startup in the solar space before. And when I came back to university to finish my degree, that's when I discovered Hacking for Defense. So in a way, I feel lucky that I took that time off because if I hadn't, I wouldn't have been able to take this class. So I was a junior at that time, although I'd taken 2 years out to work.
Can you talk a little bit about the problem that your team was handed or competed for?
Yeah, we work closely with 7th Fleet to look at basically situational awareness for the maritime domain. And the first way the problem was presented was we probably need a bunch of sensors that are autonomous and cheap and we can deploy in the ocean so we can see what's going on there. And it quickly came to our realization, actually, I shouldn't say quickly, it was quick, but there were lots of twists and turns that the teaching team helped us out with, where we realized the problem was not so much the sensing, the problem was just the command and control and the situational awareness around it. How do you integrate all of these different data sources? And I think our situation was one where the key value add that we provided was working with our sponsor to identify the right problem to solve. And I remember at the end of the class, we had this presentation and our sponsor from 7th Fleet was like, this is what I always suspected all along. And this is what I was trying to tell my superiors. And you guys have really been this outside validation for what I wanted to say.
So you kind of gave him the confidence to go back in and say, this is all the market research, this is something that we should be focused on.
Right.
Are you still communicate? Go ahead, Pete.
I would say that, one of the products of this class is the world's best market research into a specific problem. And part of the product is the students are building a very unique language and understanding of the problem space and the potential solution phase and the pathways towards deployment. And quite frankly, they are the world's experts in that problem at the time. The data they produce is defensible, which means the problem sponsors can take what these students produce and actually use that to defend their decisions against virtually anybody who wants to question why they made a decision to go left versus right. It literally is amazing the results you get from them.
And let me just double down on what Pete and Darren said, and maybe use a different choice of words. Instead of market research, which says, gee, I've read a bunch of stuff and here are some numbers, we're actually gathering evidence. So if you think about it, these are evidence-based decisions, not being done sitting in a building, coming up with a set of requirements or a set of opinions about a solution. But actually, once you get out of the building and start talking to all these folks and putting these minimum viable products in front of them, you have some real evidence that either these things are true or not, or here are the real needs, or here was the real problem. That's very distinct from, I've done market research by reading other people's reports. And that distinction actually turns faith-based arguments into fact-based arguments. And that is, at least when you're doing innovative things on day one, all you have is a religious activity. That is, you believe. But you very quickly need to turn that faith into facts as quickly as possible. And this methodology that Darren went through and is now being taught in 47 universities through Ensign and DIU, that's what the methodology does. It allows us to very quickly get down to what is the real ground truth and what is the real truth about the potential problem and how we might solve it. So sorry to riff on that, Pete, but
no, you're right.
So Darren made a point about his problem sponsor had kind of expected this outcome and now had the data, to move forward with it. Is that normal? I mean, when you finish the course, do the problem sponsors you say, yeah, I knew that, or has it gone a completely different direction?
Is that a question for me, Heather?
Whoever.
Pete,
I'm probably gonna let Darren do that one.
All right, Darren.
Well, I don't know if I'm qualified. I mean, you have seen many more generations of the class than I have. I think it's a solid fraction of the outcomes, right? Like sometimes you have the sponsors who suspect something, but they need that data, turn that faith into fact, as Steve put it. But there are other times when they really haven't thought about it at all, and they really needed an outside perspective. So I hesitate to put statistics to that. I think the BMNT team and Hacking for Defense would know a lot more about those stats.
I think the two outcomes of it. One is typically the first pivot in a class is when the student team looks at the government problem sponsor and says, your problem's wrong. And here's why, with the evidence to back it up. And that's 99.9% of the problems that have been through this course have changed dramatically over the first 4 weeks of the course because of the discovery and insightful analysis of the students looking at real evidence, which is tough for somebody sitting in the government to get, because the students are not just talking to government people, they're also looking in the adjacent sectors that where does this problem present itself in the commercial world, and how does the commercial world see this? And quite frankly, almost all problems that governments have shows up someplace else, and it's a matter of being able to compare the two, where some of that great learning comes from. I think the other significant part of this is they are building the most beautiful network of people around this problem over a period of time. And it's not just a bunch of people. These are actionable people that if you drop the right catalyst in the room, will suddenly come straight to work on that problem and actually do something about it.
Are you saying the network of the people inside of the DoD or outside?
All over
of
the place. Both.
Oh.
You realize that the students have by the end of the course they've interviewed 100 to 150 different people, and these are conversations, they're not surveys.
Mm-hmm.
And in many cases they've gone back to them multiple times with the evidence that they produced, and over time they can actually look at a crowd and say, if you want to start to work on the problem, here are the 10 people you need around the table to get started.
And Heather, for some of these sponsors, it kind of creates cognitive dissonance where, traditionally, gee, I start with a set of requirements and then I kind of push it into a system, and then we go, go through PPE and planning and requirements, and finally the acquisition program, and we simply build something out. Instead of this process, which says, well, are we sure this is actually a requirement rather than an opinion? Or is this going to be timely by the time we deliver it, or still needed or wanted, or are there other solutions? Rather than, again, assuming everything we've just said are knowns, this process kind of says, ton of these are actually hypotheses. We're just effing guessing. So why don't we go out and validate whether these are really true? The other thing, and I think that MRAP problem that Pete talked about and the cycle time of Al-Qaeda illustrated a different problem, is when you're doing this discovery, you know, that problem to an unmounted soldier was a lot different than the general sitting somewhere in the Pentagon, which was a lot different to someone in Congress, which was so different beneficiaries and stakeholders have different views about the problem priority, about how to solve it, about its urgency, and et cetera. The class and the whole process in general gets you out to all of those and has you have to adjudicate between, well, whose problem are you actually solving in what order? That's another kind of mind expanding part of this process that the students learn about. Well, wait a minute, not everybody views the problem the same with the same priority at the same urgency. Pete, is that a fair statement?
No, I think that's quite accurate.
And potentially their motivations are conflicting.
Yeah, almost always.
Almost always.
If I could ask you to reflect a little further on that, one of the common issues that I you know, teams I led faced, we did about, probably during my last 15 years, 300 of these kinds of projects, none of them in defense area. But one of the things that, as I've gotten engaged in this world, is was also true in the corporate world. There's this layer of cement in the middle, and you know, so I'm wondering how that played out for your teams, where, you know, sometimes the people at the very top are extremely enthusiastic. The people at the bottom who are living with the problem are totally grateful and, you know, telling you exactly how it is. And then, you know, there's this layer of cement in the middle where action gets stalled.
Yeah, there's a term for that, Greg, called the frozen middle, right?
Yeah, there you go. It is frozen. I think it's sometimes, you know, got rebar in it too. But anyway, how did this process allow you to break through that frozen middle? It sounds like it did, and I'm wondering why you think that's true.
Pete?
Yeah, it absolutely does. In fact, there's I forget where I wrote the op-ed. I think War on the Rocks or Defense Model someplace. But I actually talk about my experience at the Rapid Equipment Force of dealing with the frozen middle. And I personally don't like the term, because I think, you know, quite frankly, we've built enterprise organizations that are supposed to be efficient. And everybody in the frozen middle is doing a job that they're told they have to do. And they're defending that job against all things that cause inefficiency. The part of this course is about discovering the personas that touch the problem and a potential solution pathway. So we start with, you know, who's the actual beneficiary of this solution? And I'm not talking about the buyer, I'm talking about the person who's going to use it. You're going to solve a pain point. And then we discover who's the buyer, who's the senior leader champion, who would be supporters and advocates of what you're trying to do that you can leverage, who are the key partners. And we also go hunting for the saboteurs. And by saboteurs, it's not about bad people, it's about people who would not want to see this happen because they're incented a different way.
Right.
And once you discover that, you can start building a solution to that. And I would say, you know, some of the most powerful advocates that these teams have built is converted saboteurs who realize what the students were going to do were actually going to solve something else for it. And I think that's part of the process the students have to work through, is identify them, understand the value proposition that would cause a saboteur to not want to do something versus solving that problem for that person so that you recruit them to actually be part of things. And Steve taught me a great word yesterday. It's called ambidextrous organizations. This is an ambidextrous approach that says recruit the best right people to your team and understand the value proposition that you are delivering to all of them and ensure that you continue to do that so they stay as part of your team. That's innovation leadership. That's it takes to manage that process that the students are actually learning in a really practical world. Steve?
Yeah, that's it, Pete. I think you nailed it.
Really quickly, we're going to come right back to this, but Darren has a hard stop at 10. Darren, thank you so much for being here. I just have one quick question. How hard was this class? Like for real. How difficult was
Well, I would say drinking from the fire hose for sure. I remember at the end of our class, we said, oh, over these 10 weeks, we interviewed 108 people. And we weren't the ones with the most interviews, by the way. And I think the hardest piece of this is often not building the technology, right? You got a lot of fantastic technologists working in these teams, but the hardest part is sometimes making sense of conflicting opinions. You'll have party A say one thing, party B say completely the opposite, and then party C say something that is out of left field that doesn't contradict either of them, but doesn't work with either of them. And figuring out why that might be, I think to Pete's point, what are their incentives? You know, whether it's unconscious or conscious. Why might they be saying that? And you just have to frame everything in the context. That's the hardest piece.
awesome.
So I will double onto it. I think anecdotally, particularly this first class, said that this is the hardest, most professional, rewarding class that they took in their Stanford career, because it allowed them to take everything they learned and every network they built at Stanford and use it to work with real people to solve a real problem, which gave them real experience. That accurate, Darren?
It certainly does. And with that, I have to say thank you for letting me fill in for Payam. I know I hope I did not disappoint. And I'm always happy to help out with this.
Thanks,
Okay.
Darren.
Darren, thank you.
Thanks, Darren.
So jumping back in, I know that you know, some of these classes, I think there's been a method to the madness on the graduate level. Some of these teams have actually become companies. And Brian was going to join us. Something came up, but his team actually became a company. Can you guys speak a little bit to that success that you know, what this class has built?
Pete, you want to talk about Capella?
I can start with Payam's company. You know, Payam is like a lot of, you know, really bright university students had ideas about building something and solving something. And in Payam's case, he had this idea for creating a sensor for synthetic aperture radar from low Earth orbit satellites. And, you know, from scientific, quite frankly, the only way you get SAR imagery prior to Payam showing up was off $1.5 billion satellite that gave you a soda straw look at the world. You know, Payam's, you know, thought was, I can do this on low Earth orbit satellites and get refresh rates and create you know, lots of imagery. Payam realized on his way through this course that what he was not building, he was not going to build a satellite company, he was building a data company. He got to the end of the course, and the day after the course ended, closed a $200,000 seed round. By the end of the summer, had closed a $1.5 million seed round. 3 months later, signed a contract with the NRO for almost $10 million. They put up first satellite yet. Raised, I think, another 12 in May. So in less than a year, he'd accumulate on $15–20 million, but then another $20 million right after that. Payam's company's flying, I don't know how many satellites he's got up today, Steve. I think 6 or 8, but it's a sizable company that is actually doing great things to the world. In fact, you go to Capella Space Online, you see beautiful imagery. They're shooting through the clouds, and the refresh rates are great. You know, I think total across all the universities, we've had, I think, 16 companies started that were specific to the problem. I will tell you, the students who've been part of these teams, there are probably 3 times as many who've gone on to actually start other companies at the same time.
But Heather, the interesting thing that surprised the heck out of me is, if you remember, my initial motivation was just to get students who would never be exposed to the national security enterprise kind of engaged in seeing their counterparts and feeling that they were part of a unified nation. But the real surprise for me was the percentage of students that not only just started companies, but remained connected to their sponsors or their agencies, or in some way, maybe they weren't working on this problem, but they became consultants or joined the Defense Digital Service or did a tour, or we've had a couple actually join the military based on what happened in the class. And that's been repeated in these 47 universities where this program is scaled. And that for me was completely unexpected. I wasn't, at least in my mind, I wasn't recruiting, but in fact, the notion of service extended to the students as well. And the fact that the DoD has some of the toughest challenges in the world, both technical, strategic, operational concepts, et cetera, and they're getting tougher as we sit. You know, those appeal to the best and the brightest who go, well, I could do service and work on things that are interesting. And the country has kind of figured out, and the DoD certainly figured out, that maybe we ought to think of this as a talent pool that's just been historically untapped. Because I think, as I inferred earlier, you know, for the last 75 years at least, the DoD owned all the technologies that it needed to win and prosecute a war. And literally in the last 10 years, whether it was AI or machine learning, autonomy, quantum, commercial access to space, et cetera, and now being driven at a size and scale that are outside the DoD by commercial interest. And, you know, unfortunately, with a good chunk of them being driven by China. And so being able to tap into this technology base and this interest base that just wasn't here 5 years ago, I think provided an asset to the DoD that for me was unexpected and obviously great to see. So I just answered a question you didn't ask, but
Right.
That I'm going to add to it. We had 1,000 students take H4D classes across the United States this year, just about 1,000, which is roughly equivalent to the freshman class of any one of the military academies.
Yeah.
So in a sense, we have created a new pipeline for talent that not necessarily going directly into the military, but will impact the networks and companies and others that creates, I would call it, a new class of public servant. People have experienced a unique framing of the military, have actually made connections in some specific place that changes the way they look at military service and military problems. It irrevocably changes it. And I think that's, 100% students will change their thoughts and opinions. They no longer are ambivalent about it. They actually made personal connections with people in the military about a certain pain point, and they are strongly motivated to stay connected with them.
But I like the way you kind of talked about like the transcending all levels, because I think that's critical. You can have the technology solution, and actually Jared here in the comments from Orbital Bridge said that psychology, not technology, is the hardest part. And so I think you guys are really attacking both of those, which is critical to deployment. Really quickly, so Greg is from Baylor University and runs a bunch of innovation activities over there. But if somebody like Greg in Baylor wants to get involved with Hacking for Defense, how does he do that? Greg, I'll let you ask the question.
Yeah, well, let me put it this way. On our own, without Baylor is not Stanford. It's very different personality, very different size, and we're not in Silicon Valley and so on. But what I find amazing is the correlations between the way we put a technology entrepreneurship program together, so that grad and undergrad, engineering, law, business, everybody could come together to solve real problems. And so I'm a huge fan of not only that kind of learning, but a fan of Steve's because I got engaged later on in that into I-Corps and just saw the dramatic difference of even what I thought I knew about understanding customer needs that changed when you turn it into actually having to interview people. And a lot of them. And so, I think Baylor, for example, is a fertile ground for a well-organized now machine, process. Ours is a little bit DIY, I would say, because that's how we did it. We just said, kids have to learn differently than they're learning. Otherwise they won't know anything really about commercializing technology, which is what we were about. We didn't have a defense focus, but some places may not be as fertile, but in general, how does a school or a region or engage with you, and what are the kind of things you find they have the hardest time grappling with, with this different model?
So I'm going to start, and then I'm going to let Steve talk. Some of the pedagogy that I think gets in the way sometimes. From a macro sense, I would say that it's not just hacking for defense. We're actually running a program for Homeland Security.
Yeah.
They will essentially build the same. We started with FEMA, the Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity Agency is going on now. The TSA will launch a course, and I think the Customs and Border Patrol is next. There's also a hacking for an environment or climate course that we launched that I think was taught in 3 universities this year. There's a hacking for energy program. The State Department is sponsoring hacking for diplomacy that Georgetown University is teaching. I think they're going to add another school this year. So the basic pedagogy and the premise is all over the map in terms of where things might be appropriate for different places. We're also starting to have conversations with a much larger group of people about hacking for local, which is the concept of taking Main Street problems in local cities and connecting local university students to their city's issues. I live in Austin, and I would absolutely give my eye teeth if UT Austin would take on homelessness as a solution, because I think they would blow the city away in terms of what they would come up with a solution. So that's kind of my spiel. The onboarding process, the best way to do this is first identify the professors who want to teach the course. And I highly recommend getting a tenured professor, somebody with a stature like Tom Byers was at Stanford, but somebody substantial in the University, Bill Perry, who's got some clout. Yeah. That says this is a good idea, not just from a national service standpoint, but it's also good for the university. Get them involved. The second part is to attend an educator's course. And the way things are working, particularly for hacking for defense, the National Security Innovation Network, which is part of the Defense Innovation Unit, is the government program sponsor for hacking for defense. Okay. The Common Mission Project, which is the nonprofit that we spun out of BM&T, actually manages the course and sets it up and runs it, delivers the problems to the universities and does the university onboarding. So CMP, in partnership with Ensign, will run a series of educators courses throughout the year. It's like a 3-day course that really gets into the pedagogy of how to teach. How do you build the course? Yeah. Once Ensign, if it's a hacking for defense course, that the university engaged with Ensign, and Ensign says, yes, we're going to bring you into the coursework. CMP will then step in and help onboard the university administratively. Is how do you teach this? How do you build a network across the university to actually support this and within the community and kind of set the standards and other things? And then CMP will also provide all the course support. So all of the modules and all the other things you need to teach it. The Common Mission Project now has this stuff all online for the instructors.
So if I understand
Steve,
you right, there's not the job of going and finding the projects to work from is something that's handled centrally rather than each university member having to go do that homework on their own, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That doesn't prevent a university from introducing problem sponsors that they're interested in, but the process of attaining problems and conditioning them so that they are adequate for universities and supportable, it's a discipline. BM&T still does that nationally. Okay. We do all the sourcing and the curation, and once we have the problems ready, we hand them off to the Common Mission Project for distribution to the universities.
I just want to comment on Pete's last comment, Greg. This curation of the sponsor problems was a massive learning for us in how do you actually get the right problems and the right mindset from sponsors, which is the real value of having a central location to do this. And that's a testament to the learnings that and the value that the Common Mission Project kind of brings. And as Pete said, if you have or someone in your university has relationships already standing, for gosh sake, bring those problems in as well. But there's now kind of a crank turning process to kind of scale this. And again, the class is kind of a microcosm of what's now being stood up in various components of the DoD itself. That is not just a class, but how to solve some very specific problems where it's no longer we know the threats or the technology. We kind of know, we think we have a problem here in South China Sea or, in the Kaliningrad corridor in Eastern Europe, et cetera, that we might want to have people look at and deploy rapidly. And this is kind of a methodology that's now been tested to be used to solve some of those problems.
Well, I think that's a tremendous outcome because, even corporate innovation teams don't know this. This kind of methodology is much, much bigger. Heather, I forget how much time we have left, but looking ahead to this evening and here, I think, somewhere in this Biden proposal to really up our game with technology and the 100 billion he wants to put into some things. This, you ought to give him a call this afternoon, Steve, is what I'm saying, this is great stuff. I love it. I can appreciate how hard it is because we've had some of the same journey, but not at this scale. And I'm awfully glad you're there and a resource that we can rely on across the country in various settings. So
Great.
thank you.
Thank you. We do need to wrap up, but actually just from the chat, Zach Levy wrote, he said the experience with the first Stanford cohort arguably helped the asymmetric warfare group write the initial draft of the U.S. Army's counter UAS strategy and tactical pocket reference guide. We just had to get DoD folks past the initial stranger danger. So that's a pretty solid testament to the program. But thank you guys for joining me today. We are at time. Steve, thank you. Pete, thank you. Greg, thank you. Darren, thank you. And I guess I'll kick it back to the team. Thanks, guys.
You bet.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Heather, Greg, I appreciate all of you. You guys did a great job. It's great seeing you again. Really appreciate it. What can I say? You do a great job. Everybody appreciates that. I guess you could probably call up anybody and they would show up and they would agree to be on your panel.
That's that.
24 hours a day. We will build an entire event around you, ma'am.
As someone that was in the news business as an anchor for over 30 years, you could get a job tomorrow if you wanted as a news anchor. So just something to think about. Good job. Great job.
Bye now.
Thanks, guys.
So Heather is fantastic, very knowledgeable, has a deep understanding of the space and spends and is truly dedicated, a lot of passion, and spends an inordinate amount of her time connecting people and paying it forward. So I just want to thank her again.
That's something that's very unique. I know a lot of people that know a lot of things, but when it comes to bringing people together and matching them up and say, I know somebody that you need to know.
Yeah, she does that all the time.
Oh, unbelievable. That's a real art. That's a real art.